Welcome to another lesson in Module 4 on growing and storing forages. Today we're going to focus on tips for harvest and storage of organic forages. My name is Rick Kersbergen and I work for the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. I'm an extension professor and work out of the Waldo County office. So the goals for this lesson are to gain an understanding of the importance of timely harvest and preservation methods to maintain optimum quality in the feed that you're going to present to your dairy cows. We hope to teach you how to adjust your harvest and storage techniques and to minimize losses during storage and feeding. And really, when we talk about minimizing losses, it's an area where there is a lot of shrinkage or loss during the dairy farm harvest season. And so hopefully learning some techniques to minimize some of these losses will help you in your dairy farm operation. So what are we going to cover? We're going to discuss briefly some characteristics of forages and understanding the importance of digestibility. We want to talk about harvest changes and tips for maximizing the quality of the feed during harvest. How to minimize losses when we go to preserve some of those feeds, whether that's silage or hay, and how to minimize those losses so we preserve as many nutrients as possible, and how to minimize the potential for loss during feeding as well, and how do we maximize animal performance on the high quality forages that you're trying to prepare for your animals. So realize that once a plant gets cut, the quality declines. It's always important to realize that. And that's why we try and emphasize top quality pasture management, because animals are consuming that feed as a fresh plant and we don't see that quality decline as it does with stored feeds. So once the plant gets cut, whether you're out there with your hay bine or chopper in terms of corn silage, once the plant is cut, the quality is going to decline. So your goal should always be to try and minimize or reduce the amount of losses during harvest and during storage. And realize that the quality of the feed also influences how well it's going to store. So especially for fermented feeds, the quality of the forage influences the type of fermentation that's going to occur that's going to preserve that feed. It's also important to realize that we need to minimize the amount of contamination that potentially occurs through harvest. By contamination, I usually mean the fact that we're introducing some potential pathogens and other outside sources of material that potentially could negate some of the quality of the feed and also potentially create a hazard for our animals when consuming some of that feed. So here's just some good examples in terms of what makes a good quality silage. And you can make this hay as well, but if we have poor quality forage and we have poor silage management, we're going to end up with a poor product. Whereas if we have high quality forage with excellent silage management, we're going to have the quality feed, quality silage that we want to feed our cows. So not only do we need to grow a quality feed, we need to use excellent harvest and storage management skills to produce a high quality feed. Realize that 2 to 3 weeks of management or bad management can impact a whole year of feed quality. You're producing feed for those animals for the winter months when you need to rely on that quality feed to produce quality milk. So when we look at forage harvests, whether you're harvesting a hay or a silage, realize that the fundamental strategy for hay preservation is to dry that feed down or desiccate it as quickly as possible to somewhere below 20% moisture to limit biological processes. So we store hay by drying and minimizing any bacterial degradation that's going to occur because it's just too dry once it's in that hay package. With silages, it's a little different. In silages, we're trying to produce a feed that's going to be preserved through fermentation, and it needs to be an anaerobic fermentation. So our goal is to preserve that feed, top quality feed, and do that we need to exclude the oxygen from the package, whether it's a bale or a bunker or an upright silo. By excluding that oxygen, we're going to encourage a fermentation that's going to drop the pH of that feed and allow it to be fermented and preserved. So here's a graph that a lot of people use just to show that the inherent problems associated whether it's a hay harvest or a silage harvest. And you can look at whether you're going to have losses in the field or losses during storage. So when we look at to the right, we're looking at field cured hay or a dry hay product. And in that situation, we tend to have lots of harvest losses. And those losses can be losses due to weather exposure, could be just inherent losses in the fact that we're cutting a green plant and letting it be exposed to nature for an extended period of time till it's dry. Whereas we look at the other side, the left-hand side of the graph, we'll see that we have silages and haylages where we have more storage loss. During that fermentation period, we're seeing a decline in nutrient quality. We have little losses in the field because the material is less exposed to nature and less exposed to time out in the field. So we have less field losses, but we have more storage losses. So that's why a lot of farmers have switched to a haylage product, which tends to try and minimize both field losses and storage losses. So the primary objectives for a hay quality or hay harvest are to try and harvest that material at an immature stage and to reduce the moisture content of that hay product as quickly as possible. So by doing that rapidly, we're going to minimize losses that would occur in the field. So it's critical to try and think about how we harvest that, whether we're going to cut relatively high so we have good air movement. We're going to cut during weather periods where the field is going to be exposed to the maximum amount of sunlight, because sunlight is a major factor in how quickly a hay crop dries. So it's critical to try and dry quickly. Quickly minimizes a lot of the field losses. What are those field losses? The biggest one that we look at is respiration losses. When that plant is cut, it continues to respire. And when it's respiring, it's actually using a lot of the potential feed resources. So it's actually respiring, producing CO2 and H2O and burning off materials. So not only are we losing dry matter, we're losing probably more of the most digestible part of that plant through respiration. So the more rapidly we can reduce those respiration losses and get that material down to about 50 to 60% dry matter, the quicker we're going to minimize those losses and maximize what we're going to be able to preserve in that hay package. There are also some other environmental losses that can occur, whether that's through rain, leaching losses by exposure to moisture, and then also the fact that we're moving that package, whether we're mowing, raking, tedding, we are shattering leaves. And when that occurs, we're losing the most digestible part of that plant as compared to the stems. There's been a lot of research recently done by both Tom Kilser and Dan Undersander concerning the fact that when we mow packages for hay or for silage, we can really reduce respiration losses by exposing as much of the material that we mow to sunlight as possible. So the wide swath technique of mowing and laying that material out as wide as possible, exposing maximum amount of that material to sunlight, will decrease the moisture content more rapidly than if we had mowed in a windrow. The other thing we need to consider is mowing height. If we mow a little bit higher, we're going to minimize the potential for soil contamination in our feed, as well as also allow more digestible part of the plant to be harvested, and leaving enough residual that we get rapid regrowth of that plant material as well. So cutting height is also an important factor. So one of the things you should do is look at the ash content of your feed analysis and see how high it is and compare that. If it's too high, you're getting more soil contamination. And if you're going into a fermented feed package, that potentially could create a problem of health issues in your dairy cows. So what's the right moisture level for baling dry hay to prevent mold? It differs between square bales and round bales. And it's important to realize that the larger the package, the more dense the package you produce, the drier it needs to be for good storage. So small bales, sometimes you can get away with 18 and 19% moisture. If you have a large package, there's a 4x4 large bale, that needs to be considerably drier. The same is true for round bale silages. But realize that when you're making those packages, that it's important to understand that larger packages need to be drier when they're baled to prevent molding. And when it does occur, the molding occurs, it reduces the amount of potential nutrients available in that package, whether that's protein or energy. So just a good summary of haymaking practices. We want to maximize how much drying that can occur that first day. So especially in the Northeast or in cooler conditions, we want to mow as early in the day as possible to allow for a full day of drying. We're trying to get those respiration losses under control as soon as possible. If we mow late in the afternoon or in the evening, that plant is going to sit and respire until the dry matter of that plant declines enough to stop or halt respiration losses. If you're making dry hay, it's important to condition that hay to crimp the stems, especially if you have lots of legumes in your hay. We want to make sure we maximize how much of the hay gets exposed to sunlight, so we want a wide swath. When we move that material, whether that's raking or tedding, we want to make sure we don't do it when it's very dry. We want to rake or ted when we're about 40 to 50% moisture content to minimize leaf losses. And then again, bale at the right moisture content depending on the type of package. And then finally, to store that in a way that we're going to minimize losses during storage. You've put a lot of time and effort to produce a good quality hay package. You don't want to lose a lot of that quality by leaving it exposed to the outdoors. So round bale packages, this is one of my pet peeves. This is actually my neighbor who stores their hay outside and also feeds outside. So a substantial amount of loss potentially in that hay package. And obviously the animal knows where the best feed is and leaves the rest. Dana Understander also put together some estimates of what kind of losses we see with round bale hay packages that are stored outside. Now obviously these packages are somewhat designed to store outside with minimal storage losses, but actually when you consider the losses both from the exposure to the elements on the whole outside as well as moisture that's going to suck up from the bottom, we see that there can be up to 50% of the dry matter loss can be substantial in some bales when exposed to weather outside. Obviously different types of hay and how that hay package is either wrapped with twine or with netting, as well as the types of grasses are going to influence how much loss. It's significant, and it's a lot of time and effort that you've put in to produce a quality feed, and seeing those losses out in the field are substantial in terms of what it costs you in terms of your overall production system. So just looking through some losses that potentially could occur, and again another graph that looks at how much potentially could occur over time. With poor management, we can lose up to 71% of the nutritive value of the crop that we're trying to harvest. That's huge. There's always going to be field losses, there are always going to be some harvesting losses, some storage losses, and some feeding losses, but really your goal as a manager should try and minimize those. So if we turn that around and look at what could occur under optimal management, we potentially could reduce the field curing loss down to 12%. Again, trying to minimize how much we lose during respiration by wide swath. Handling those hay packages carefully will reduce our harvesting losses. Finding a storage way of storing those round bales in this situation, whether that's wrapping dry hay or trying to put that dry hay in a barn so it's not exposed to weather, not sucking water from the ground or being rained on, can reduce those to substantially less than if they were left outside. And then think about feeding loss. How do you feed them? Using round bale feeders? Are you unloading them? Are you feeding them out in a feed bunk? Minimizing feeding losses. Optimal management, we're only going to lose 29% of that hay crop value from mowing to feeding to our animals. Well, the goals of making silage might be a little bit different than those of making hay. In silage, we're trying to preserve a maximum amount of nutrients up front, again, by harvesting a top quality material that's going to ferment well, and then putting it into a situation that's going to preserve those nutrients so we have a stable product that's going to give us what we call excellent shelf life, and we're not going to lose nutrients during that preservation period. What happens when we make silage? Well, when we take a material that we're trying to ferment, we're trying to ferment that in an anaerobic situation. So what we look at is how quickly can we go from an aerobic phase, meaning we're harvesting that feed and putting it into a package, whether it's a silo, whether it's a round bale, and then we're wrapping that and trying to allow the bacteria in that package to use up that oxygen and then potentially go to what we would call an anaerobic fermentation. And by doing that, we go through this period of aerobic phase, and the idea, our optimum would be to minimize the aerobic phase. Then we go through a lag phase where the anaerobic bacteria are beginning to develop and grow. And that's what we want to favor, that anaerobic bacterial growth, because their end product are volatile fatty acids. And those acids tend to drive the pH of the whole package to a level that's going to preserve that feed. And eventually, those bacteria are going to die as well, and we get to the stable phase where the pH is low and we have no more bacterial degradation occurring. So that period can be anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 to 4 weeks over time. So what we want to try and do is minimize the time that the material is in the aerobic phase, and thus make sure we also have material that's going to allow for a good anaerobic fermentation phase from day 2 to day 14 or beyond, and maximize the pH drop and get that as quickly as possible. Whether we're doing round bale silage or if we're doing upright silos or bunker silos, the principles are all the same. So the goal is to establish a stable mass by lowering the pH and maintaining anaerobic conditions. Factors that goes into producing a good quality silage is the fact that we need to have adequate carbohydrates for those bacteria to ferment. And different crops have different carbohydrate levels that are available for fermentation. So some crops are inherently harder to ferment than others. So if we look at this list, you'll see that corn silage and some of the forage sorghums and even the sorghum Sudan grasses and millets tend to have higher concentrations of water-soluble carbohydrates. So they actually ferment quite well. Whereas if we look at alfalfa, it has a low concentration of water-soluble carbohydrates and also has a higher buffering capacity. So legumes and alfalfa are inherently a little bit harder to ferment, and so it's important to make sure you use top quality management techniques, especially when harvesting alfalfa and legumes versus grasses. So normally when we think about harvesting chopped material or round bale silage, what we're trying to do is to put material in a situation that's going to derive the quickest package that's going to be anaerobic. So with chopped silage, we chop it, we put it into an upright silo or a bunker silo, and we pack it to try and minimize the oxygen concentration. With round bale silage, we're trying to produce a package that's going to be high density, that's going to be a very tight package, and we're trying to get that wrapped and put in an anaerobic state as quickly as possible. So when we look at packing density, it's important to realize the more dense we can pack the package, the lower our dry matter losses are going to be during the fermentation period or that aerobic period. So more dense material, we're going to have less oxygen in the package, we're going to have a better fermentation. So again, think about that when producing whatever it is you're producing, whether that's round bale silage or material going into a bunker silo. The density of that packing is critical. So when we look at bunker silo management, it's important to realize, we want to produce a package that's going to have a good density throughout. And one of the situations that's often occurring is we put material in a bunker silo without packing it adequately. Normally, most bunker silos are packed by driving a tractor over or some heavy implement over. What we need to make sure we realize is that when we pack that material, we want to pack it in layers, meaning that we don't want to put a lot of material in at once and then try and pack it. we want to add material in layers and pack each layer individually. And that's going to produce a material that's going to have higher density throughout the entire bunker silo. The other thing we need to think about is the fact that we're trying to minimize oxygen infiltration. We don't always think about is the fact that depending on the side walls we have and the type of bunker silo we have, we want to minimize how much oxygen is coming in from the sides as well as the top. And so a practice is becoming more and more important is to try and actually line the sides of the bunker silos with plastic to minimize oxygen infiltration. I was in Europe recently and all their bunker silos are lined with plastic before they fill them. It's a way to minimize oxygen infiltration from the sides and minimize waste material that's going to occur on those edges that we often see in many bunker silos. One of the things we need to think about is when we do that is how to minimize how much water actually comes in on the sides of the bunker silos. So if we're going to line that inside, we also need to think about the fact that the top of the silo may rip and tear plastic. And so one of the techniques I've seen recently is to use carpet or drain hose or drainage tile along the top of the bunker silos to try and protect that plastic to minimize how much tearing and ripping can occur and try and maximize the amount of water that we're going to keep off and out of our silage packages. The other new technique that's been around for a few years now, which does make a huge difference, is using an oxygen barrier film to cover the bunker silo. Here's some data that shows that an oxygen barrier film really reduces the amount of dry matter losses compared to a single layer of plastic to even a double layer of plastic, and also reduce the amount of visible mold that's going to occur on the top of that silage, especially in a bunker. So huge difference in loss. You can reduce the amount of loss of feed material by using an oxygen barrier film. Again, many people in Europe, where feed resources are very scarce, land is very dear in Europe, and so whatever material gets harvested, they're trying to minimize any losses. All of those farms in Europe use that oxygen barrier film. They also use canvas tarps on top of that, try and minimize how much losses occur during storage. So think about that when choosing a type of material you're going to wrap or put in your bunker silo as a cover. Sealing the edges is important. Here are some gravel bags that seal the edges of the bunker silo. You can do that along the top as well, so you can make sure that the water that's running off the bunker silo doesn't go into the silage, but actually will either run off the top or down the sides where you've lined it, so you don't get rainfall infiltrating into the bunker silo. You can also seal the edges with other materials. So here they're sealed with soil, where they actually put on the edge of the bunker silo to try and minimize oxygen infiltration. So those are another techniques that you can use to try and maximize how much nutrients you preserve in your forage system. Here's an example that shows the fact that top layer of silage tends to be inherently poorer quality than the bottom layer. And so some of the factors that we see is this is looking at NDF levels, and again, NDF levels are the amount of fibrous constituents in the feed and tend to be of lower quality feed. So the lower the NDF value, the better the quality of the feed. And these samples are taken and look at the difference between the upper part of the silo and the lower part of the silo. And when the NDF levels tend to be higher near the top, it means we've probably had poor fermentation occurring and we're losing some of the cell contents of the material, that material that's more potentially nutritious for our animals. So if this silo had been covered with an oxygen barrier type plastic and had packed appropriately, we probably would not have seen nearly as dramatic a decrease in quality as we go from bottom to top. It's also important to realize that feeding feeds over time really can be influenced by environmental conditions, and this is especially true in bunker silos, but this can also hold true in round bale silages. And realize that when you're producing round bale silages and feeding them out, each package is an individual package, and the quality and moisture content can vary dramatically from bale to bale and field to field. Well, when you're feeding out of a bunker silo, you're also feeding out a material that can change in quality and dry matter during time, because you're also exposing some of that material to rainfall and snow. So it's critical to make sure that when you're feeding forages out of a fermented system, whether it's a bunker silo or wrapped bales, that you adequately adjust your rations for dry matter content. So here's some data that just shows the dry matter content of an alfalfa haylage coming out of a bunker silo. The same bunker silo over time, it's going to dramatically change. And when you're balancing your rations, that dry matter change can really influence the type of production you're going to get out of your animals and also the health of your animals. So if the moisture content of that feed increases dramatically and you don't compensate your rations appropriately, the amount of concentrate you're feeding, you potentially could send your animals into acidotic states, causing them to off-feed to create some health problems for your animals. So monitoring dry matter content of the feed as it's coming out of the silo is critical. How you manage the face of a bunker silo is important. So trying to minimize losses, because again, you're dealing with a package that's anaerobic, and every time you open it up, you're actually adding oxygen to that package, and you're seeing a secondary fermentation occur. So understanding that fact and really trying to minimize how much feed gets exposed to oxygen over time is critical. As soon as you open that up, it deteriorates. And what you want to do is try and make sure that the amount of material you take off every day is not going to heat up while it's waiting for you to unload that feed. You want to make sure that every day you're taking sufficient amount of material that you're getting to a fresh face every day. You want to think about how you feed your animals and the time you feed them. You may also want to think about the strategies of feeding, meaning that the first feed coming off the face of the bunker silo may want to go to heifers and animals with a lower plane of nutrition. And then once you get into fresher material, you want to use that feed to feed your higher producing cows or early lactation cows. So keeping that face clean, minimizing the amount of oxygen that's going to get into that face are critical to maintaining quality and minimizing losses in that silo. So realize that there's a domino effect from when air is introduced to any fermented package. So what happens is that a variety of microbes are going to wake up and start degrading some of the material. So whether it's yeasts or other bacteria that are going to start digesting that material as if it is actually in the cow's rumen. And they're going to go after the most important nutrients, the most digestible nutrients. And so they're losing that quality as well as using dry matter. Heat's produced, and that's going to potentially bind up some of the proteins. We see more molds and bacteria causing further spoilage, and you're getting a reduction in the quality of the feed. So here's an indication of how much heat potentially could be produced by looking at a bunker silo with poor quality management where lots of feed has been knocked down. It's probably going to sit there a day. And you can see with the heat diagram on the right-hand side that a lot of that material in that pile is heating up. We're seeing a degradation of that feed value, and it's going to be poor quality feed, going to produce less milk from that feed being fed to your cows. A lot of producers have gone to round bale silage as a way to make a fermented package in an inexpensive way. There's some things you need to think about when we do that. The fermentation tends to be a little bit different. So when you're comparing a chopped silage in an upright or a bunker silo to baleage, you'll see that the pH does not decline nearly as much in baleage as it does in chopped silage. So it's critical to think about that, and also think about how you wrap that package, that round bale package, and how you store that to minimize oxygen infiltration. The other thing to think about is the fact that there is a difference between individually wrapped bales versus inline wrappers. The inline wrappers tend to be more economical. You're using less plastic, so they tend to be a little bit easier to manage for some farms as compared to the individual bales. But you need to think about the fact that if the size of the bales going in inline wrapper are variable, it's going to create some air space as well. So uniformity is important when we think about baling packages that are going to go for an inline wrapper versus an individual wrapper. When you choose plastics, when you can choose twine and wrap, make sure that it's going to be appropriate for the package that you're doing. So we want to avoid oiled sisal twine. You want to buy plastic or untreated sisal or net wrap for the packaging material around that bale, and then buy good plastic wrapping. Oxygen limiting plastics are going to be more cost effective in terms of the nutrients you're going to conserve in that package. It's also important to think about how often you overlap that package so you have enough material creating an impermeable package for oxygen. So if we look at this and look at the amount of potential heating that can occur between the types of plastic and the mill rate of that plastic. So if we look at the red line, that's a 2 mil plastic, and you can see that the temperature stays relatively warm, near 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas once you get down to levels that are close to 3 and 4 mils, meaning we have that much more overlap of plastic, or that we have a better quality plastic, we're seeing a much more quality fermentation occurring, and that by day 8 or 9 we're down to 80 or 70 degrees or almost ambient temperature at that point. So we've actually created a package that's going to be more resistant to further deterioration over time. People look at the number of wraps that are going to occur in terms of how many times that package gets wrapped. We want to make sure we have good material. We want to make sure we have a minimum of 4 layers, because that overlap material really helps try and minimize how much oxygen is going to be potentially permeating the package. And you need more layers as the moisture decreases. Okay, so realize that as the moisture of the package increases, you need more layers of plastic. And also, as the maturity of the crop increases, you probably want more layers. Again, the more digestible the material is, the better quality forage, the better it's going to ferment. So as the material is more mature, you may need more plastic to really minimize how much oxygen is going to occur. And then realize we don't want to make many holes in the plastic, so we want to make sure we don't bale crops that are going to poke through and create oxygen infiltration areas in the plastic. So wrapping time is a question I also get, is how long can I leave that bale before I wrap it? And here's some data from Dan Sander and others as well that looks at the fact that you really need to wrap those relatively quickly. We see temperature spikes, even if we wait 24 hours, we see that temperature spike up to 120 degrees, and trying to minimize that potential. So ideally we want to wrap that package as quickly as possible. And we've seen now balers that actually wrap as part of the baling, meaning that you can continue baling and wrapping at the same time, which minimizes the exposure of that bale to further oxygen, further heating, and further degradation. So no matter how you store your forages, it's really still important to harvest that top quality feed to preserve the maximum amount of total digestible nutrients you're going to harvest per acre. We want to really manage that to reduce field and storage losses. So whether that's trying to dry more rapidly, reduce respiration losses, handle that crop carefully, and then put it into some sort of package that's going to minimize storage losses. You're going to spend a lot of time and money to produce a quality feed. We want to make sure we want to reduce the amount of losses that are going to occur during storage and feeding as well. It's also important to check forage quality and to make sure that you compare some of your practices to the quality of the crop feeding. That's the way you're going to understand what works well in your system and what doesn't. So make sure you take forage samples, understand quality, look at the parameters that are being presented to you, and make sure you feed those forages in a ration that's going to optimize the amount of forage you're going to be able to feed and the quality of forage you're going to be able to feed to your animals.